Welcome back to GlowPOP Reads. God, it's been so long, hasn't it? The story I'm currently reading is Bendy and the Ink Machine, Dreams Come to Life by Adrian Kress. If you haven't seen the previous chapter, I suggest you listen to that one before this one so you can catch up with what's going on. But if you've already done so, I hope you'll enjoy this one. Also, be sure to subscribe, leave comments, and click the bell for more content. Don't forget to support me on other social media sites, and feel free to leave me a coffee as well. Links are in the description. And now, on with the story! Chapter 5. I didn't see Mr. Drew at all that day. That made me feel a little bad. A little worried even that he hadn't really met his job offer, or that he'd forgot all about me already. When I made it back to the art department, though, it seemed like a giant spotlight was shining down on me. I was definitely not invisible anymore. When they say throw yourself into the work, they don't mean actually. Is this some conceptual art piece? You want to be a cartoon character when you grow up? I think there were other things the gang in the art department said, but I can't remember. I remember them laughing. I remember my face getting hot. And I remember just trying to get the little odd jobs everyone asked of me done as quickly as I could with as little conversation as possible until the end of the workday. The clock ticked on. 5 o'clock? 6 o'clock? I was more than ready to go. So much for day one of the dream job. But no one told me when the day was done, and no one around me got up. All the heads stayed bent over their desks, their pencils furiously scratching at their papers. "It's okay, buddy. You can go," said Ms. Lambert. I jumped a bit. She kinda snuck up on me. "I can stay," I said. I didn't want to look lazy. I was a hard worker. "It's okay. Everyone's pushing toward a deadline, and this is your first day. Besides, it looks like it wasn't exactly an easy one." She grinned at me. I didn't know what to say or do, and I kinda did just want to run away. The thought of going outside covered in ink like this really didn't make me feel great, but I did as she said and grabbed my jacket and made my way home. I stayed very focused on the sidewalk beneath my feet. I wasn't in the mood to catch folks staring at me. It was harder to ignore the shouts from the people in my neighborhood. "Hey buddy, you fell into a vat of chocolate there?" That kind of thing. I made it home and dashed up the stairs, knocking into Mr. McKenna coming out of the bathroom. That tired old towel wrapped around his waist, his belly bulging over it. "Watch it, kid!" I burst into the apartment and flew past Ma cleaning dishes in the kitchen and into my room. I came to a short stop. I'd forgotten. My grandfather. He was standing in the small space between the foot of the bed and the wall, staring at the oversized painting hanging there. I suppose the painting itself wasn't oversized. It was the size it was. It just was really big compared to the wall, and it dominated the room, I'd always thought. "Just need to change my shirt," I announced, but he didn't move or even make any kind of sign he'd heard me. Not even a grunt. "Kozula," I said. My Polish was terrible. I only knew dribs and drabs. I wasn't even sure how I knew the Polish word for shirt in the first place. Telling him that didn't seem to do anything either. So I edged my way up to him, trying to get him to notice me. When he didn't, I finally just climbed over the bed in order to get at my dresser. I glanced up at the painting as I went by. It was a nature scene, with the mountain and trees. It wasn't really painted realistically like a photograph, more like the artist had slapped paint on thickly and had accidentally come up with the picture. I was so used to it, so familiar with every shape and every line, but I was familiar with more than the picture itself. There was also the heavy gold frame. When I'd been little, I'd asked Ma if it was real gold. "It wasn't," she said. I'd said if it was real gold, we would have sold it and gotten a new apartment. And also, more food. She'd smiled. "The frame isn't what's valuable. I didn't get what she meant then, but I did a few years later when Tommy Sharp told me he'd seen in the paper that a painting that looked a lot like one of ours had sold for $10,000 at an auction. I didn't believe him, and we'd gotten into a fight about it, but I'd gone home all bruised and looked at it, and it was like my whole world had come into focus then. I noticed the other paintings in the apartment, the ones stacked above each other against the length of the hall. I noticed how they took up space all the way to the ceiling, almost like they were being stored. They were all crooked, dusty. I'd lived with them for so long, I hadn't noticed that the paintings were something to notice. Ma, we could sell these paintings, I'd said. We could have money. You could stop working yourself to death for Mr. Schwartz every day. What ideas you have, she said with a laugh, getting up from the table and ruffling my hair like I was still a little kid and not 13. Money's important, Ma, I said, turning in my seat to watch her. Don't tell me money's important like this is not something I know. She leaned against the sink and looked at me. We aren't selling the paintings. They have value. You even told me that once, I said. Did you see the paper? No. She turned back to the sink, but she didn't do anything. She just stood there, silently. Tears don't make noise. People think they do because when people sob and stuff, they make sounds with their throat. But actually, you can cry and no one will know. But I knew. I always knew. What I didn't understand was why she was crying. My heart sank into my stomach. Is it about Pa? I asked quietly. We hadn't had a letter from him in weeks. She turned abruptly, her eyes wide and red. She seemed scared, but not in a way I can really explain. I bet you could, Dot. Then suddenly, her expression softened, and she said, Oh, your Pa. No, it's not about him. I looked at my grandfather as I made it to the dresser and opened my drawer. It suddenly clicked in that memory. Is it about Pa? She'd thought I'd been asking about her Pa, not mine. She'd always been hiding something there. About her family. What was he seeing in the painting? Why did it matter? What was I missing? I pulled out my shirt and grabbed my other pair of trousers and slammed the drawer closed. It wasn't fair. I didn't need this. I didn't need some mysterious old man who didn't speak English in my room, in my space, making everything complicated. I didn't like how he made Ma sad either. She was always so happy except when she talked about him. Why was she letting him into her life like this? Our life like this? Why was he standing way too close to that painting? It was all too much. Today had been just too much. I stomped my way across the bed again, which isn't actually a thing you can do. It's more like you kind of trip angrily and fall off the other side. And I was back in our narrow hall. I stripped and changed my clothes and flung the inky ones onto the bed. My grandfather didn't flinch. He just stared. And kept staring. Chapter 6. Working at the studio was not at all what I thought it was going to be. I mean, it wasn't bad. Anything was better than being a delivery guy for Mr. Schwartz, outside in the heat of a New York summer. That being said, I'm not so sure I would have chosen being a delivery guy inside in the heat of a New York summer either, especially in a stuffy, airless animation studio. That's not to say that there weren't some advantages. Watching the artists at work was a huge one, of course, when they let me. Jacob always allowed me to glance over his shoulder a bit, but Richie? Nah, he hid his work from me like he was writing secret messages to the Allies during the war. Also, honestly, being able to tell people from the neighborhood I was working uptown for Joey Drew Studios was pretty great too. They were impressed. They were jealous. And the folks I met at work were pretty swell too. Most of them. Miss Lambert, who ran the art department, was a bit severe and sometimes frustrated me when she told me to sit down at my desk and stop hovering all the time. She also wore men's suits, which I found fascinating and definitely an inspiration for some kind of character I figured I would create. Someday. When she finally allowed me to draw. which couldn't come soon enough. I wanted to learn. I wanted to be part of the group. Then there was the rest of the team. Richie, Dave, and Jacob, who I'd met that first day. They were like this little gang almost. Their desks sat in a row along the wall under 3 bright lights. Richie and Jacob looked to be in their 20s and were full of energy. Richie was rough around the edges and always reeked of cigarette smoke. The tips of his fingers were even yellow, which I learned when he passed me some new sketches. Looking over the top of his small round glasses at me with suspicion. His clothes always looked a bit wrinkled, and that made me feel better since, after the Sammy incident, I now had only one set of shirt and trousers to my name. Didn't even have a suit jacket. Jacob, on the other hand, was a snappy dresser with brightly colored ties and matching socks. I didn't even know they made socks in colors other than black and white. Sometimes he'd even wear his hat indoors. He seemed okay, though he was the one who teased me the most. He couldn't seem to let go of the whole me being covered in ink thing. At least when he brought it up, he smiled. The fact was, he teased everyone, so I tried not to take it personally. Dave was older than all of us, and his skin was as thin and dry as a piece of paper. After Dot had explained what had happened at the studio after the war, I wondered how an older fellow like him felt about taking orders from a woman, if he was stuck in old traditions and stuff. But he didn't seem to care much. He didn't do anything, apparently, but draw and take long lunch breaks. He didn't really talk with anyone. He turned in his work on time and went home on time, except when the department was under deadline. But because my job was a gopher, as they called it, I got to know people outside just my department. Generally, I took things from one person and gave them to another. There was a lot of coordinating that had to go on in the building, and I was the one bringing everyone together. I felt like that alone ought to have earned me a bit more respect, but I was definitely the lowest rung on the ladder. For now. So I brought scripts from the story department to the art department, sheet music from the music department to the animation lab, receipts from everyone to accounting, and bills from accounting to everyone. I got to know the secretaries. I got to know the bosses. I got to learn that Sammy was Samuel Lawrence, composer, award-winning musician, and head of the music department. Seeing him not covered in ink for the first time was strange for me. The angles of his body were even more pronounced now that he wasn't hidden under the goopy ink. He kind of looked like a bird, especially when he'd sit at the conductor's stand during rehearsals. The violinist still gave me the creeps. I got to know Norman Polk, the guy who'd led me upstairs during the blackout, though he had no interest in getting to know me. He ran the projector, which I'd learned happened when they needed to sync up sound with a moving image. So there was a projector booth up in the music room like I'd noticed that time. And then there was one in the voice recording studio too. Norman knew all the actors and musicians, and he watched when they performed. I could tell that. He watched from behind the flashing light of the projector. I didn't know him super well, but the few times we interacted, I got the feeling he didn't like me. Called me Drew's gopher, which wasn't true, but also I didn't know what was wrong with that. It was almost like he didn't like Mr. Drew or something, which I didn't understand. How could you not like him? I'd only met an actor once in those first few weeks. I'd held the door for her on the way into the building, and was struck by how not like anyone else in the studio she looked. I mean, she looked like she stepped right out of the pictures. On the day when I held the door for her, she was wearing a light gray skirt and jacket with a pink blouse underneath. She wore a small hat with a lace front that covered one of her eyes, but not completely. I have to say, I never understood why she was a voice actress. She was just as pretty as Ginger Rogers, with the same kind of platinum blonde hair, too. We'd ended up in the elevator together, and I'll tell you, she was very nice. Said thank you when I held the grape for her, and even asked me my name. Buddy! It was all I could manage to say. I couldn't even ask what hers was. Well, I'm Allison, which is funny, right? She said with a smile as we rose. I didn't want to stare, and I didn't understand why Allison was funny, so I just shifted from foot to foot on the floor of the elevator. Because of Alice. Allison. Alice. It's so close. See? I could tell she was looking at me. She wanted me to find it funny and clever. Come on, buddy, come on. Oh, you're the voice of Alice Angel, I said loudly as the elevator landed on my floor. Allison laughed. Yes, Well, it looks like this is your stop. Nice to meet you, buddy. She stuck out her small gloved hand and I took it quickly in my sweaty one, shook once, and practically ran out of the elevator into the art department. Hadn't seen her since then, and honestly, I was relieved by that. I did get to see Dot more often. Ever since our strange adventure, she decided we were friends, and while I still didn't get exactly why she decided that, I didn't mind it either. It was nice when she sought me out at lunch, or showed me a new script she was working on and explained it to me instead of just handing it and ignoring me like the other writers did. Maybe it was because we were close to the same age. Maybe it was because even though she got to actually write and wasn't a gopher like me, it still seemed like she was getting the grunt work of the story department and was on the lowest rung like I was. She mostly corrected spelling and grammar from what I could tell, but at lunch she'd sit at my desk in the dark corner of the art department as the pipes overhead made their grunts and groans, and tell me all about different bendy stories she'd come up with. "I've got a great one with him as a cowboy," she said, biting into her sandwich. "I like cowboys," I replied. Maybe it was just her gut instinct about me that made us friends. I didn't really care. It was nice to have a pal. The one person I didn't see, however, not once the whole time, was Mr. Drew. I understood he was busy. He was in charge of the whole thing. I hadn't expected that he would come and check on me in person, or invite me to lunch, or anything like that. But I did think that maybe he'd want to follow up at least once after hiring me. Maybe I'd just been imagining things like I did, but I really thought he'd liked me. "That's just Mr. Drew," Dot said. She'd convinced me to go out after work to the pub across the street. It was a small, crowded hole in the wall down a couple stairs where clearly a lot of after-work types hung around. The place was full of men, and even some women crowded against the bar and sitting at the few tables by the door and in the back. The air was so thick with cigarette smoke it made me cough at first. Dot was 18, so she could drink, but I was a little relieved when she grabbed a root beer instead. Helped me not to feel quite so babyish. We'd collected our beverages from the bartender and found a spot by the wall. "What's just Mr. Drew?" I asked, almost yelling above the noise. "Disappearing. That's what he does. Just stick with your work. That's all you need to do." I sighed, but I knew Dot couldn't hear it. I leaned in to talk into her ear. "It's just that I'm not doing the work I want to do. I need him to tell Ms. Lambert to let me draw." Dot shook her head and gave me a small smile. "You don't need permission, buddy," she shouted back. "Just do it. Draw." I shook my head. No, I don't have time. I'm running around all day. You know that." "Then do it at home. Draw some bendy stuff. Show Miss Lambert." "On what?" I asked myself. "With what?" Dot didn't understand. "Yeah, I had a pencil and scrap paper, but I needed proper tools. The paper at the studio was thick and crisp and absorbed the ink. I couldn't just hand over the back of a grocery receipt. I didn't want to anyway. Didn't want them to see how little we spent on food. I can't." Dot looked at me. I was getting used to the look now, so I just looked back. If she could read my mind, if she could just figure out my issue without me having to tell her, that would be great. And then, she did. Not really, of course. She just had this way of knowing what people were actually thinking, not what they said they were thinking. She didn't say anything. She just reached into her pocket and passed me her key. "Borrow it. I'll keep it in my desk from now on in case you need it again." I didn't take it, just stared at it. "You want me to use this?" I said slowly. "Yes, to get yourself the right materials, buddy. Get yourself some paper and some ink." I shook my head. "That's stealing." "It's borrowing. You're doing this for the sake of the studio, after all. On your own time, no less. And anyway, you want to show some initiative. This is how you do it." On the one hand, she was right. It didn't seem like that big a deal. It wasn't like I was going to take the stuff and then sell it to the kids in the neighborhood or anything. On the other hand... "Think about it," she said. I pocketed the key quickly. "You're a bad influence," I said with a little laugh. Dot shrugged, like she did. "Maybe just more of a pragmatic influence. They hired you for a job, so do your job." Pragmatic. Didn't know that word at the time. I looked it up later. Pragmatic, meaning dealing with stuff sensibly. Taking out the emotion. Making a choice because it's practical. Didn't think I agreed with her that that's what this was, but I wanted to. I'll think about it. And I did. I thought about it all night, lying there in bed next to the bony figure of my grandfather, whistling rhythmically through his nose as he slept. I must have dozed off at some point, but it felt like I had spent hours awake, thinking about living like this, with my ma, now with my grandfather, sleeping here in the big bed, in the big room, in an apartment hardly big enough for a single person, let alone a family. All the other families in my building living with 5 people or more. This big room that used to belong to my parents, until my pa died, and then it belonged to me. "You're so tall now, buddy," Ma had said. "I don't need that much room." Tall like he'd been tall. Imagine more rooms. Imagine an apartment that didn't suck in the heat and suffocate you inside. Imagine owning a suit. Couldn't borrow my paws. I couldn't put it on. I just couldn't. I wasn't going to have more rooms and a suit as a gopher. I was too old to be a delivery boy. And anyway, the studio had so much paper and ink it was drowning in it. Like Sammy. Covered in ink. Running through actual pipes, apparently. When I woke up in the morning, I decided I knew what I had to do. Dot was right. It was the pragmatic choice. It was the only choice. So, that was the end of chapters 5 and 6. I managed to squeeze in both because chapter 5 was really short. What did you think? Did you enjoy them? If so, feel free to leave your comments, like the video, and share it around if you want me to continue. Thank you so much for watching. This is GlowPOP Artisan signing off, and as always, I will see you all in the next video. Stay safe and stay sweet, my apples. Ciao!